Well, welcome to today. Welcome to Lunchtime with CMJ, and the third live meeting of this week and the last of this week, and last in August, of our meetings with Kelvin Crombie. It's a privilege and a pleasure having Kelvin with us, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say today as well in response to your questions and comments. First of all, I just want to go through his books again and see, make sure that you know where to buy them from, see if you've already got them all. So this one is the 200 Years History of CMJ. And it's a book that Kelvin wrote, which I believe is one of the most foundational books that CMJ has. It is the foundational book. It's our history. And every single person who supports or is interested in CMJ should have their own copy. Easy to get it from our online bookshop or just ring the office. And then another book that I think, and I've said it each time, is a must, is his book on covenants. And you can get this from our online shop as well. So that's Israel, Jesus, and Covenant. And again, you know, has God broken his covenant with his ancient people? No. You just have to read the Bible to see it. And the next book I want to show you is the one that we had the talk on last Saturday, and we had a recording on Thursday in St. Albans, and it's on Basilian Anayoch. And this book at £7 is just brilliant. It's such a bargain. You must get it from the bookshop if you can. It's so clear, and it presents a lot of the things we've heard this week and just set out beautifully. So I really do recommend you get that book. And the next book is the one that Kelvin wrote for France that we translated. And that was just for €5. You've heard me talk about that. So that's the strategic link between France and Israel. And that takes me in to our first question today. And the first question we've got is on France. And it's, are you, Kelvin, are you planning another book on what you found in France?
Right, am I on now?
You're on now, yep.
Oh, I'm on now. Okay, well, actually, we better not say that question too loud. I don't want my wife to hear that there might be another book. And if my daughter's here, there's another book, they'll say, no, Dad. But that one there that we wrote on France hasn't been written or translated into English. You got to translate straight away into French, I think. So what we could potentially do, and it's in a sense it's your call from CMJ UK, is we can actually take that one that's been translated, keep it in the English, and just add a bit at the end about the storyline that we've been talking about concerning the Holocaust and the Jewish followers in Jesus that were involved in the different camps. So we can actually make that an addition rather than a separate book, just utilize what's there already, because the whole concept of France being strategically significant in Israel's restoration. I remember, Jamie, when we did that conference and the speaking engagements we had in France that year, 2019, seems like a lot long ago than that. The French were quite amazed, weren't they, at how they fit into this bigger geopolitical plan, God's sovereignty in history. So it could be that it might be interesting for non-French people also to read that.
Yeah, that's true. I think, Kelvin, that's a yes, isn't it?
It could be a yes, but we'll see how we go.
Yes, I think that little book is going to triple in size in this case, but that would be exciting to wait for. And you're right. If we've got it in English, there's stacks of people would love to read it too, find out what happened, because many people don't realise at all. So
there's no problem for me thinking that God used the French. No problems at all. But it's you English, British blokes that's the problem. You've had this long-running feud with the French. So if you say yes, then we'll go for it.
Yeah, we have a problem with the French. The English, we thought we were the only ones in the picture. Not really. Okay, so the next question also about France is one that, if you can clarify us, you spoke about a man who said that neither he nor anybody known to him knew anything about the camps in France. Can you remind us of that man, please, and where he
Uh,
came.
Well, the only thing I can think of that comes close to that question is that when we got back from our trip down to Gurs that day, we had to speak to the little congregation, or part of the congregation, the little Protestant congregation in the southern part of France. And you were there as well, Jane. You remember that nobody actually knew anything about there having been a concentration or a detention camp at Gurs. I'm sure they must have known there was some camp there, but I don't think they had any idea that there were Jewish people that were there. So I was quite surprised, particularly when a person who had, and I can't remember his name, had been the minister from that little congregation. And he'd done his theological training in Po, the nearest town. So I think that's what took me by surprise. And I mean, it may very well be the case that we spoke to Gubby Fourcade that day in the town, and she said that her husband was there, but they were kept away from the reality of what was happening. They were told that there were naughty people there and bad people there, and so even the locals weren't even aware of what was really going on in that camp. So it may be that there are people in the broader area had absolutely no idea. But we saw those. What amazes me, though, there were so many school groups that were there that day. If you remember, there was a couple of groups of school kids. So they must be getting educated on it, on what happened.
Yeah, as I remember, though, I think it was Gabby's husband that you were talking about, and the fact he lived just round the corner. And he's a lot older than she was, wasn't he? And so he'd already died, but it was the fact that he didn't know anything. But he said, didn't he say that they'd heard some children? They'd heard the children playing. And
I think that was, if I recall rightly, we didn't take notes so much about those conversations, but I think that confused them because they were told they were just naughty, bad people there, yet they heard the sounds of children.
Did we ever find out Gabby's husband's name?
It might be in my notes somewhere.
Yeah, I don't remember.
If I get around to doing this next chapter in the French book, then we'll have to find his name.
The next few chapters, yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so we're just going to skip over to Poland for the next question, and this is back to the Joch family. So Kelvin told us about the terrible details of Basile's discovery, arrest, and subsequent execution. Was there any evidence to suggest that he'd been betrayed by somebody local to the authorities?
Well, what we have are several different reports, one coming from Jacob himself and the other coming from the testimony of Anna. And it seems to be that there was, after the soldiers had been in the billeted out into the house, then they went off to the front line, and there must have been administrators, including a postman who was there. Now, it's not quite clear men were in the house at the time, but one of them used to be frequented by a prostitute. And so what seems to be the case that when Basile, he came out of the woodshed for a couple of days, he was getting tired of it, and he said to Anna that the rice and the mice and the rats were getting into his hair, and he probably just needed a bit of a clean up, I suppose, and he came home for a couple of days, and he was getting ready to go back. Now, probably what happened is that the prostitute, must have then reported to the authorities. And then right at the time when Basile was going to go back to the woodshed, they burst in to the house, did the body search, and so on and so forth. Now, there's nothing that I have found of primary evidence to say that she received a material inducement, but what we do know is that at that time, by 1944, and there were different stages when they were doing the roundups, the actionim of the Jewish people. There was a time when they would just take the Jewish people, put them onto the trains and send them off to Belgique, to Sobibor, Treblinka, etc. And then afterwards, there'd be a time when they'd actually go around to look for noticeable hiding places where the Jewish people could have actually hidden. And it went by degrees. And then that was what they called, I forget what it's called. It was like Jugendjagd or something, the Jew hunt. And they go out and actually, for instance, they go to a place where there's a forest and just go through systematically and flush Jewish people out of a forest, and there'll be people on the other side. Rachmiel Friedland, for instance, who wrote a little book called Joy Cometh in the Morning. He was involved with the Mildmay mission to the Jews. He survived, but he has actually described also that particular aspect of going and hunting for the people. And many times the Jewish people, they hid in all different sorts of places. And then after a while, the next stage was then to actually put out material inducements, the offer of material inducements to the local Polish people to report where Jewish people were in hiding. So it might very well have been that this prostitute did actually report Basile's presence in order to receive a material response.
Can I just?
It was terrible. Really, when I read through, there's a particular book put out by a Polish gentleman, and I can't recall it straight away. But when I was reading through that upset me almost. I would say that upset me more than reading of the accounts of the Jewish people being taken from the houses and the ghettos and put onto the trains and sent off to the death camps. That was a little bit more clinical in that sense. But when you start reading through these other aspects, when they'd actually then go and flush out and look every single place for Jewish people, that really, really upset me.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. And you can see why, like in Corrie ten Boom's case, the man that made that hiding place that was not discovered was a rarity. It was incredible, wasn't it? Yeah. And also, I mean, Anna Yoch, she hid in broad daylight, didn't she?
She was able to disguise herself as a Gentile.
Yeah.
And there's a guy called Rabbi David Kahana. He was a rabbi at the time. He was also in hiding. And there was one of the great heroes of this whole Holocaust-related story is Archbishop Sheptytsky from the Greek Catholic Church. And he hid lots and lots of Jewish people in his monastery in Lvov itself and other places as well. And one of those was Rabbi David Kahana, who survived, and so did his wife and child. He later went off to become the chief rabbi of I think he was in the Polish army, then the Israeli Air Force, and later he went to Argentina, I think. So he was a very prominent person. But he related quite a bit in his story, Lvov ghetto, or something like that, that these Jewish people were called phony Jews, or phony Gentiles, or phony Poles, Phony. They had to make believe they were Polish in order to survive. So Anna spoke fluent Polish, and according to what she wrote, she didn't look so Jewish, whereas Basile looked distinctively Jewish, and so she was able to get through through that. I mean, that's a couple of years. How can you continue to do this? Yeah, for a couple of years. But anyhow, so that's what it was like for a lot of those people having to hide out, and not in the forest or something like that, but actually within the Polish society, and to give the pretense that they were actually Polish people.
Yeah, to hide in broad daylight. Wow. Oh. But when they took Basile and Anna was beaten up, as far as we understand, I mean, many Gentiles who hid Jewish people were executed, weren't they?
Yes, they came back for her later, but see, even on that, there were two different stories. Okay, she said she fainted. Okay, and but her son Jacob later wrote that she was struck, but she herself had been badly beaten not long before, as well. And so you've got to sort of put, this is after the time when people are putting these stories together. So you've sort of got to stand back a little bit and see the three different perspectives, and just say that collectively she was obviously beaten badly. And when she was beaten badly on that first occasion, she kept going because she knew she had to continue to feed Jacob, who was Basile. She knew she had to continue to supply food for him. So she must have been beaten quite badly on that occasion, that she'd even write down that she had to keep going because she had to supply food to her husband.
There's no reason given why she was beaten.
Well, there was a reason, because she had been hiding some of her stuff, the the postman, Mates, had gone away, and then somebody had suspected that something going on in the house, and they came and found Jewish stuff hidden that she had hidden. But so at that stage, they mustn't have suspected that she herself was Jewish, just that she was hiding Jewish stuff, and so she was beaten. So it could very well have been that when Jacob Yoch wrote what he wrote, he could have been combining the two aspects, the first meeting, and it might have been that when they came to pick up Basily, she may have been flung or something like that. But more than likely, she just went out through shock or something. But they did come back later, and they must have thought she was dead because she heard them saying things, but they didn't take her away, and so she survived.
Wow! Whoa!
The most amazing thing, one of the most amazing things about this is that not just did she survive, but she was paralyzed completely for the first 3 months, and it must have been that her son. Another son, Pavel, and his wife, Elizabeth, they must have somehow been involved in the picture there, helping her out. But then she was paralyzed from the waist down. That when they later managed to escape from the Soviet area into Poland and later into Germany, she was paralyzed from the waist down. So it must have been a real big ordeal for them to have actually made that escape from the Soviet side of town. Because what happened is that they must have been quite anti-communist, quite patriotic Polish. So when the Soviets took over that area, and it came again under Soviet control, and then of course when they got into Poland, because it was a communist sort of regime that was then set up in Poland, the authorities on both occasions came looking for them because Basily must have actually had some sort of a reputation previously, and so they had no choice in a sense. They had to get out of any communist-controlled region, be it Soviet Union or Poland. Quite a story. How they got out is quite a story. Yeah,
it is. It's amazing that everyone must buy the book. We're going to move on to a slightly different thought here, and this question. It's really just a thought. It's a compliment to you, Kelvin, and it's also wondering how you're going to carry on or what your thought is about it. The scope of this project must be as long as a piece of string. Being based in Australia, research on the ground is necessarily limited, but amazingly fruitful as your experience in France proved. How long do you intend to make the piece of string? Whatever its length, you will have done a huge amount of work that would pave the way for someone else in the next generation to be endowed with your cloak. How about your eldest daughter? I don't know what she'd say.
I better tell her that one. Lots of things in that particular question. We did relate the other day to the openings that the Lord provided for us in France, but on that particular research trip, I spent 10 solid weeks, and similar things are actually happening all over the place. And I'll just relate briefly one particular thing, which was in the Netherlands. And I'm working on the Netherlands story right now because CMJ also had a vibrant work in the Netherlands for, over 100 years or so. But in my initial readings for what happened to the Jewish followers of Jesus in the Netherlands, I came across some information concerning a list that the Nazis had put together concerning the non-Aryan Christians, the Jewish people who were involved in the church, because they got all the Jewish people in those countries to register. And when they registered, and the one little particular area was religion. Well, we know they're all Jewish because that's why they're being registered. So in that area of religion, it means, are you Orthodox? Are you secular? Are you conservative? Whatever they wanted to write. But in that particular box with the people in the Netherlands, a lot of them wrote down RK, Roman Catholic, in Dutch, or they wrote down all the different denominations, Protestant denominations that were there. So some bureaucrat later went and took hold of those 140,000 or so forms and then took aside all those who'd written that they were involved in the church in one form or another. So that was then made into a list, and I think something like 1,900 or so names in that list. So I heard about this or read about it, and I thought, well, the only way I'm going to actually get any further with this this research in the Netherlands, I have to find that list. So in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, there is a very significant Holocaust research museum archive. So I went there with my sister-in-law the first time, Lexi's twin sister, and I had some basic secondary sources, and I went to the archivist. This archivist could tell you everything there was to know about, in a sense, the Holocaust. But when we asked him this, he didn't have the foggiest idea. And so he said, well, where's your source? And I said, well, that's what I've come to you for. I've come to look for it here. And so we went through 4 different secondary sources. We found a secondary source. He alluded to the same thing, went to another book, went to the other book, and then he alluded to another book. But the end of the story was we couldn't actually find anything relating to the primary source. And that's a bit of a problem. So next thing I know, he brings out a massive big pile. It really was, a big pile, bigger than that, actually. It's not the 5th story. It was a big pile. And it's all the materials relating to the Jewish, the church, basically, and the Nazi authorities. So it was a massive big thing. And what was interesting here is I'd already been speaking to my wife and her family that their grandfather had played a role, and their great uncle had both played, because they're involved in government levels, and both played very supportive roles on behalf of the Jewish people. So we started going through this massive big pile of material, looking for this booklet that's got all the names in, and suddenly my sister-in-law sees her grandfather's name coming up, not once or twice, but a number of times. So she gets all excited, and I'm saying, well, what do you think I've been telling you all this time? Your grandfather was involved in a very positive way. And so she gets stuck onto that, and she kept on reading in detail. When you're doing this sort of research, you can't go into the detail. You've got to skim over stuff, otherwise you'll never get through. So I said to Doreen, getting towards the end of the day, I was like, oh, we got to move on. Look, we haven't even touched this pile. So then she gets into it, and suddenly she just says, Kelvin, I think this might be it. And it was a little booklet. And it was quite a high moment, in a sense, when you're doing research. But the only problem was it was very detailed. Not only there's all these, many names, but there's about 7 categories there of different information about them. And these aren't people who died. These are just people who registered themselves as being involved in the church. But you couldn't photocopy it, and you couldn't photograph it. Because, my policy, and you've seen me, I go and photograph everything. And so I had to get there with my laptop, and we got through probably about a page or 2. Then I came back the next day with my brother-in-law, and he had his laptop and my laptop, and we started going through it. And then Lexi and Abigail came over, and I got Abigail to come down with me one day, and we finally got it. So with that information, when I came back to Australia, I had a big, thick book with the names of the 104,000 Jewish people who had perished. So then I actually had to go and actually check out those names from the list onto those who were in the book. And even that was not completely satisfactory, because in the Netherlands, when people marry, they keep their maiden name. And so you had to do a lot of cross-referencing to try to find who these people were. That took a long time. And so ultimately we have pretty close to, I suppose, the full list. It won't be conclusive. There'll be some people's names are not in that, and there'll be others their names might be in that, but they may not be anywhere near being involved in the church. But nevertheless, you've got to use what you've got.
It's all incredibly fascinating.
The idea there is we'll actually put that together in a book, ultimately, connected with the role of CMJ in the Netherlands. Because a lot of those people did actually have some sort of an involvement.
Yeah, sorry. I just needed to wrap up just that little bit. But that's amazing. But I suppose the person was saying, all this information, will you get to the end of this piece of string, or will you pass it on? Well,
as I said on the first meeting, I'm not the only one that's had an interest and is involved in this. The whole idea is that whatever we collect will be bestowed to the Conrad Schick Library and Archive at Christchurch in Jerusalem. That's the whole idea. And some of it's already there. And that'll go onto line. So I'm leaving all that to David Pileggi. He's the online person. So everything that we do collect will be online for other researchers to use. Richard Harvey from Jews for Jesus in the UK, Mitch Glazer from Chosen People in the States, Geshem Narelle from Yaddishman now, they're also doing bits and pieces around the world. I actually had some emails from Mitch and Richard the last few days, for instance. So there's a number of people, and I think ultimately a lot of the information can be at Conrad Schick. There may be other information somewhere else, but the idea is that ultimately whatever we do collect can be made available for researchers to use whenever they can.
Yeah, and all the while it's encouraging the body of believers worldwide. It's just amazing. And I was thinking you guys would all sew it up, and it'd all be pooled into one place. Christchurch, fantastic. And yeah, to our benefit. It's a great work. Same person
it will take time. It certainly is not a short-winded thing, no.
No. The same person who asked that also said this next question. Will you always be disappointed that your research into actual names of believers, although you've just come out with a list of 1,000 and on, who died, will inevitably be incomplete?
Disappointed, I suppose, in a sense. That's a good point. When you do research, okay, the desire is that you will find the information that you're looking for and you can validate it. But we've already started off at the beginning of this knowing that we would never get anywhere near the full list of names. So whenever we do find a name that we can actually say, yes, this person did fit into one of those 7 categories or was a genuine follower of Jesus, that's if you want to use the word, that is a bonus.
Struck gold, yeah.
That is gold, because we want to honour these people. And there's another person in the UK, not myself, another gentleman in the UK, and if he's watching, I'm sorry I neglected to do my research into your name. But he had a vision, and this was a few years ago, of having an event whereby we're specifically going to honour, around the time of Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Day, the Jewish followers of Jesus who perished in the Holocaust.
Yeah, Baruch. His name is Baruch.
That's it. Okay. And I know this has been David Pileggi's desire from the very beginning. And so it would be, I think, good. And I think people like Richard Harvey and Mitch Glazer and Gershom would also be on song with that, of ultimately doing something whereby not just Jewish followers of Jesus, but actually people within the church collective can bring this factor out when you come to the time of the Holocaust, that they made no differentiation on faith. If a Jewish person believed in Yeshua, in most instances, in some instances it helped, in most instances it didn't make any difference, because it all came down to bloodline. And I think it's also very, very important that the Jewish community per se becomes aware of this, that it's not just a few converts here and there, but we're talking about a lot of people fit into this category. If we have specific names, it is very helpful. If we don't have the names, at least we can have as much data as we possibly can. Like, for instance, I know that in Chelmno concentration or death camp, actually, there was a whole train load came on one occasion with well over 120 or so Jewish followers of Jesus from Germany. Now, I may not be able to get all their names, but there's pretty good evidence that this was the case. This was recorded because they had a little congregation there in the Łódź ghetto. And then the vast majority of those people then went to the Chelmno death camp and were gassed on the same day. So there is that evidence, even if we don't actually have the specific names.
Yeah. What would you say, Kelvin, to many of my friends who are Jewish? Say that when a Jewish person becomes a believer in Jesus as Messiah, they cease to be Jewish, so they're not Jewish. They don't count them. What would you say to them in the light of all this that you have researched? I don't know whether your screen is frozen or mine, but
that's on there.
Are you on? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I went off for a while. Yeah.
You heard it?
No, I didn't ask.
I'm saying I have some of my Jewish friends would say that a Jewish person who becomes a believer in Jesus is no longer Jewish. And yet, in the light of all that you have just discovered and done over these years, what would you say?
Well, I mean, if people have got their preconceptions, have got their biases, sometimes it's difficult to actually budge them on that. That's why sometimes you just have to fall down back to the empirical data, say, well, listen, there were all these people who they might have been separated from the Jewish community in Warsaw or wherever. They might have been living Christian lives that when the last minute came, they actually were taken away and they were murdered as Jews. You've sort of just got to present that evidence and let them, look at it. They'll still might retain their own bias, but unless they hear about this, they won't have a chance to changing their opinion. Sometimes my experience when I was in Jerusalem, for instance, you can actually talk until the moon comes up or the sun comes out, and it doesn't make a bit of difference if people have got something. But if we have good, strong evidence, and that's why David Pelleggi is very strong on this. He's always been strong with me. So Crombie, get the evidence. Okay, David, I'll see if I can get the evidence. Because ultimately, if you want to make a statement that's going to make Jewish people pay attention, it has to be good, solid primary source material if you get it, of course. Present it. Yeah. But to come out, for instance, I've heard some people come out with numbers. 100,000 Jewish Christians died in the Holocaust and all that sort of stuff. And I see if a Jewish person reads that, they might say, okay, well, show me your data. And if you can't show your data, sometimes it actually can be detrimental, counterproductive. So I usually try to shoot for a lower number, if possible, and say, well, potentially or possibly. You could potentially say tens of thousands. That's all 7 categories together. And the more research we do and the more evidence we get, you can actually then be able to say, well, we do know that there were so many thousands, for instance.
Yeah, we could, this could branch off into a discussion all of its own, actually, because there's so much more when, you want to ask, but I think we need to move on. The next question is to do with ancestry of this particular person. And I found a flag of Palestine from 1939. And along with it is the Egyptian flag. So you said something, Kelvin, about the German worldview that made this person wonder about Jews in Arab countries. Did you say they were planning to kill 11 million Jews, including those in Arab countries?
Well, I'm not exactly sure the exact wording I said, but it is clear that in the Wannsee Conference of January 1942, by that stage, you're already into stage 7, basically, going from stage 6 into stage 7 of the murder of the Jewish people. What the Wannsee Conference was wanting to do was basically to get everybody involved and make it more administratively tight, okay, so that they would actually have a good administration over the murder of the Jewish people. Until that point was, we'll have the death camps and we'll have the shooting in the forest, but now we're going to say, right, there are so many thousands of Jewish people in France, and we're going to have to work out a system of how we get them from France to one of the death camps. There are so many tens of thousands of Jewish people in Greece, okay? Where are we going to send them? Well, we'll send them to Auschwitz, okay? The Jewish people in the Netherlands. Most will go to Auschwitz, some will go to Sobibor. So that's what they were basically began to do at the Wannsee Conference, okay? So they got all these different people in the administration, the German administration, to work out trains and timetables and all that sort of stuff. But in Wannsee, they actually had a huge map of not just Europe, but of the surrounding areas as well, into Asia and into North Africa, and also including Britain. And they had the numbers of the Jewish people in those countries. And cumulatively, that was about 11 million Jewish people. Simon Redding, for instance, when he wrote the foreword for the book, he states in there that his name was in a little black list, and I found a copy of that black list somewhere, and the Redding name is there. I mean, he wasn't born until 42, I think. So when that list was first made, he wasn't born, but nevertheless, they would have used that when they sort of invaded Britain. So yes, they did have the numbers of all the Jewish people in those other areas, Turkey, all the way through the Middle East. Wow. Turkey was neutral, but nevertheless, what they were going to work out was some way of actually getting those countries, neutral countries with Jewish populations, to actually surrender them to the Nazis. And there were about 700,000 or so Jewish people that lived in Egypt, the land of Israel at the time, Syria, Iraq, approximately 700,000. And I had a particular interest in this region because it was where the campaign of 1940 to 42 took place. And the reason I first got interested as a very small boy in matters Jewish in Israel was because of uncles who had been serving as Australian soldiers there. So I had a very intimate interest in it. And it was through the research into what's happening in the Middle East from the military perspective that I stumbled across the whole plan to annihilate the Jewish people in the Middle East. And there was a particular group called the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen were murder squads that started off in Poland, then went into the Soviet Union after Operation Barbarossa began. And they kept on going afterwards, and they murdered potentially 2 million Jewish people by shooting them. And so there were 4, perhaps 5 major Einsatzgruppen, and an Einsatzkommando was a smaller unit. So in early July 1942, for instance, in the midst of the North African campaign, at the time of the first battle of El Alamein, which was a crucial first battle, at that very time, the Nazi High Command established the Einsatzkommando Egypt. And headed up by a guy called Walter Rauff, R-A-U-F-F, who had actually been involved in the development of the gas vans, which went into Chelmno, which preceded the gas chambers. So a nasty piece of business was this Walter Rauff. Now, he was heading up a group of about, I think it was only 23 SS officers in the Einsatzkommando Egypt, but their plan was then to work with local collaborators, mostly Arab nationalists in the Middle East, and they would then begin to murder the Jewish people. So they flew into Athens. They were there waiting. Ralph went over to North Africa to Tobruk, supposedly to meet up with Rommel. And the whole idea is that once the Axis forces won at El Alamein in the second battle of El Alamein, 23rd of October 1942, once the German forces, the Axis forces won, the whole idea was that Einsatzkommando group would then come from Athens over, join with the Afrika Korps, go in, work with the local collaborators, begin to then murder the 85,000 or so Jewish people in Egypt, then into the land of Israel, Syria, Iraq as well. So thankfully that didn't happen because of the Allied victory at El Alamein. And as you know, some years ago, we discovered that beautiful little Montgomery Bible. It wasn't discovered. We knew where it was, and I just happened to put it in my pocket and walk back to Israel with it. No, I didn't, Alex. I actually got permission from it. And we took the Montgomery Bible back, and many Jewish people, when we put it on display or we spoke about it to Jewish people, older Jewish people, when I used to give my talks to them at Christchurch, they'd often they had tears in their eyes because they understood full well what was going to happen to them if the German-led forces won at El Alamein. So yes, to answer the question, there were 11 million people that were designated to be murdered in the Nazi-inspired Holocaust.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, the next question is by the same person. It's a comment. And it's really because this person has just realized that this is more personal than she had thought. So she says, if that's so, it means my mother's family would also have been targeted. My grandmother was a Turkish-born Jew living in Egypt. It certainly brings it closer to home. I think some of my dad's family also had Jewish relatives from Eastern Europe, some of whom were living in Egypt. My mother became a Christian at the English Mission College, and I'm not sure when my dad became a Christian, but they both were. So, I mean, I think that's really just a comment, Kelvin. Would you say anything else to that or not?
No, but it is very clear from the little that I have done research on what was happening to the Jewish people in Egypt itself. There was total paranoia. And if I'm not mistaken, I think they actually had the Jewish people in Alexandria actually leave, because that would have been the first town that Rommel's forces would have come into. So, yeah, yes, all those Jewish people in Egypt would most certainly have been targeted.
Thank you. And the next question, we're going back to France. So I thought this was really interesting because did your research uncover any cases of Jews becoming believers in Yeshua as a result of witnessing the courage and sacrifices of Gentile Christians on their behalf? And this person says he's heard of the evangelical church in France, that it was marvelous to the persecuted Jews during the Holocaust, and remembers reading of a French pastor, his wife, and members of his church in particular in the rural south of France who hid Jews at great risk to themselves. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, we do know that a large percentage of the Jewish people in France were actually saved. And I can't recall offhand specific instances, but we do know that the French did hide a lot of Jewish people. And there was one particular village, and, Dufka, when I want to remember it, I can't. It'll probably come back to me at 2:00 in the morning. But there was one particular French village way up in the center of the country, in the big plateau there. They hid lots and lots and lots of Jewish people, and spread throughout the country. They hid I think about 80,000 or 76,000 Jewish people were murdered during the Holocaust in France, and their population was over 300,000. So that was a very small percentage compared to other countries in Western Europe. Small percentage of Jewish population as opposed to those who actually were killed. So so it shows that a lot of people in France, probably individuals and churches and convents, were able to hide the Jewish people. Now, France is a very big country, and so they had a good opportunity of actually being able to do this, because the Germans couldn't go everywhere. Whereas if you look at the Netherlands, for instance, it's a smaller country, and it would have been so much more difficult to hide Jewish people compared to France.
Thank you.
I want to say, though, that I'm sure that in time more information will present itself, and I'm sure there are people who are watching this probably already know instances. So if you do, please send the information in. That's how you collate it. You get little bits of information from all over the place.
They did say as well, didn't they, Kelvin, that the French police, although in some areas they would say no choice, but they were very dilatory to actually find the Jewish people to round them up. They probably gave them hints that things were happening, gave them time to escape, and really helped out a lot, I think, which is really good.
I think you probably find that the case in other countries right the way through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In Amsterdam, going over to Holland now, there's a comment here, and this person says, have you come across a book by Johanna Ruth Dobshiner entitled Selected to Live? Yeah? I
have, yeah.
You have? Oh, well, do you want to comment on that?
No, not a huge amount, but it is a very good testimony.
It's a Jewish girl who was in Amsterdam when Holland was invaded by the Nazis, and somehow she evades the capture, hidden in different parts, and eventually becomes a follower of Yeshua, following perhaps staying with a Dutch family. And this person thinks that it was a result of her reading a book which she found in the house. A Dutch pastor in the north of Holland had made a great impression on her, but sadly he was killed by the Nazis in the end and executed for helping Jews to escape. After the war, she moved to Scotland, where she worked as a nurse, and there's a picture of her following this slide. There, Selected to Live. So you've read the book?
I've read the book, but it's at a period of time when I was reading everything that I could get my hands on, and of course after a while the brain gets a bit scrambled about which book you read in the context of which place. So when I get back to looking at the Netherlands situation, I'll go through that again. I did also find a couple of similar books from people in Germany as well. And I'm sure that there's many, many other books and testimonies written in the languages of that particular country. And once again, with this sort of stuff, there'll be somebody out there that knows one thing and they send it in, somebody else will send some more information, and ultimately we'll collect and collate a lot of the different material. But I think the most important thing to realize in this also is that there are a lot of stories we'll never know.
Yeah. I remember you saying, you and David were saying that actually you're a generation late in collecting everything.
That is true. That is true. And that's, we could lay awake at night thinking about that. But on the other hand, the Lord, he's graceful. And with for instance, Phil Yotch, I was able to have that interview with Phil Yotch. And Phil
coming up in a minute too.
Give a huge amount of information, but he had that material available. So that was a gold mine, as I mentioned in the first explanation. And I think I also explained how it was quite amazing how I managed to get hold of John Rottenberg's son, who lived in San Diego, and he died sometime afterwards. So we've been fortunate we can actually have some interviews.
Yeah, no, it's great. Listen, we need to move on because I've got 3 comments from the same person, but I think they're fascinating the way that it works out. Actually, I was going to say evolves, but it works out. So this person says, to expand on what I wrote in the Zoom chat, my mother was Jewish, both her parents were. By Jewish law, I'm Jewish. When I went on the Shoresh tour with Israel with my church at Ben Gurion Airport passport control, I was asked if I was Jewish, and I said yes. I still believe that was correct, and I haven't felt I was being dishonest. This person looks Jewish too. You just know straight away. Hence, I consider that I haven't been grafted in as a Gentile believer, but I'm part of the original olive tree. So that's a brilliant comment. You just come in, Kelvin, when you want to say something, and I'll plow on reading it for you to comment at the end, perhaps. As my father was a Christian, and when I was born, my mother wasn't really anything, I was brought up as a Christian. However, my maternal grandmother always saw me as Jewish, despite knowing that. When I visited my cousins in Israel after the Shoresh tour, they didn't see any conflict between my being Jewish and a Christian. Mind you, they seem quite secular, very secular. Because my upbringing was Christian and not Jewish, I wouldn't call myself a Messianic Jew, but rather a Jewish believer in Jesus, Yeshua, or even a disciple of Rabbi Yeshua. I think Richard Harvey uses that title. I do try to avoid saying Christ in prayers unless that's part of the liturgy, and I've sometimes substituted Messiah for Christ in worship songs. Next slide. Over the past 2 or 3 decades, I've become more conscious both of the Jewish roots of our faith and of my own Jewish heritage, especially knowing that 4 of my relatives died in Auschwitz, and I have e-copies of their records from Yad Vashem, and others were shot in the forest. Now, from Kelvin's talk, I understand a bit more of the context of that. I hope that puts into context what I wrote. Any comments?
That's very self-explanatory. I'm sure this particular person's testimony is similar to many, many other people's testimonies. They didn't know they were Jewish, and that's understandable. I mean, in a different, very, very much different way. But I've got a bit of Aboriginal heritage, and a couple of generations before, when the authorities here, the British authorities, and then the Australians after it was federated, were taking half-caste children away from their families completely, and so many people hid their Aboriginal heritage by saying they were part Indian, which is what happened in our situation. So we didn't even know that we were part Aboriginal. Now, understanding the context helps me to understand what my grandparents and my own mother would have had to have gone through, the circumstances. And I don't judge them at all. I think, well, I might not do any differently at the same time. So when you think about Jewish people, in many instances, that was the only way to survive, was to actually neglect or negate the Jewish connection. That's how they could survive. And then you come a generation later and people have no idea at all that they've got Jewish heritage. And it's how they deal with it. I remember Michael Cohen, for instance. It was Neil Cornell, then Neil Cohen, then Michael Cohen towards the end. I remember when he came to Jerusalem to write up his memoirs, for instance, his book about his own life story. And he had to go through that similar thing as well. How does he relate to this this Jewishness in my life, etc., etc.? And so there are many, many people How they deal with it really is an individual thing. How they call themselves, whether it's a Messianic Jew or a disciple of Yeshua or a Hebrew Christian, as they would have a generation or two ago. In a sense, it's really up to them. Their identity in Messiah is most important.
Thank you. Yeah. And of course, many Jewish people change their names. I guess that's common, perhaps, in people who are trying to assimilate. And that makes it more difficult to find things out, doesn't it? Okay, well, thank you. We're going to just move slightly different now. We're going to go to the next slide. We're going to just move on. And this slide is the giving slide, because CMJ value your support, and we also value your support in money too. It helps us to keep ticking. It helps us to keep inviting Kelvin and others like him to speak to us and to spread this so important word. So these are the text numbers to donate £5, £10 or £20, or you can ring the office. So let's move on to the next slide.
Before you go into that, Jane, can I just mention one thing? I forgot to mention it earlier, particularly for the gentleman or the lady. I can't remember if it was a gentleman or a lady, the person.
It was a gentleman just then. It was a man just a moment ago.
About the Egyptian situation.
Oh, that was a woman, yes. Sorry. Yeah.
In the Middle East, whoever it was. I did put together a book some years ago called El Alamein,
Yes.
Halting an Impending Holocaust in the Middle East, which we actually launched that in the House of Lords, and Lord Montgomery actually hosted it. So it was a great event. For that particular person and any others who are interested in the broader aspect of the Holocaust and what the Nazis were wanting to do, that does actually have a bit more information in it about concerning their question. Yeah,
well, you can get that from CMJ as well. Okay, so the next slide shows Yaakov Yoch and his family. Now, we saw this yesterday. Well, no, that was on the recording. Sorry, we saw it last Saturday when Kelvin was talking about Yaakov and his family and the Hebrew congregation, bottom right, and the car, which was the equivalent of my old Qashqai, that they used to go around to do deputation tours within Poland. So fascinating that history continues and repeats itself. So Yaakov, though, one of the great things is that Phil Yoch, Yaakov's son, sent us the only recording he has. And we're just going to play the clip that we showed in the Holocaust Memorial Service of Yaakov speaking about his mother's encounter. So here comes Yaakov Yoch.
My father was taken away by the Germans 2 months before the end of the war in a city of the Ukraine called LWOW, Lvov or Lemberg. And I don't want to become sentimental, I don't want to move you at all, I just want to state the fact. Mother was left behind. And you can imagine the anguish. She knew that he will never return. And she broke down, and she couldn't sleep. And in the night, now she told it, she survived the war and lived with us for 17 years, first in England and then in Canada, and I'm telling you what she told us. In the middle of the night, suddenly, the room lit up, and a figure appeared at the end of the bed, full of light, and she knew who he was. That was her only personal experience of the living Christ in a very particular way. She was a believer before, but it made all the difference to her. He put his hand upon her, and she was comforted.
Wow. So next slide. Oh, no, sorry. The next one wasn't it the clouds? Just go back a moment, Joel. It's okay. So that I find that clip powerful and incredibly Yeah, powerful and moving. And the fact that, you know, if you don't believe in miracles, I don't know why not. And I showed you this picture of the clouds the other day, as on the last day of our French tour, taking Kelvin to go off to Holland. And I went to get the ferry to go home. And there at the petrol station, looking up, was this amazing cloud formation, which I took as a touch, a blessing from God. And that Anna Yacht should see Jesus standing at the foot of her bed, and he should put his hand on her and comfort her at such a time of intense stress, is totally miraculous. And our God is a God of miracles. And we're going to move on now to hear of a miraculous story in itself, and that is of Kelvin's story. So you can put that slide back up now, and then I'll let Kelvin tell his own story. So Kelvin, just before I let you loose, you've often talked about growing up in the bush. What do you mean by growing up in a bush?
In a bush? It wasn't a burning bush, I can tell you that. That bush. Well, Australia is divided into 3 areas. There's a city, where all the city slickers live, and they got big peaches in their mouth because they speak a bit pot, you know. And then you got the outback, and that's where Crocodile Dundee comes from. And the area in between is called the bush. So it's not quite outback, and it's certainly not the city. And it's where the farms are and all the mining towns, many mining towns and farms, etc., etc. So that's just called loosely the bush. And so that's basically it. It's basically where the area where all the farming folks live.
So you grew up in the bush, and that picture that we were just looking at that we'll see again shows you, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's me, the little one. Okay, that's my older siblings. And we had a brick house on our block, on our farm, which was our farm was 1,800 acres. And when I grew up, about 16 or 1,500 of that was bush, literal bush, okay? Eucalyptus trees, big ones, and that had to be knocked down. So by the time I got to high school age, I think we had about 200 acres of actual literal bush left, and the rest was all cleared. So we were very much still pioneers. And we're talking about the 50s and 60s, and where I came from, it was still pioneering areas. So it wasn't cleared. Some of the farmers whose parents or grandparents had cleared the land, they were the wealthy farmers. Our family was not. My father's family came out from Scotland, and they weren't even 10-pound poms, basically. They really came out with the very, very meager stuff, and just chop the trees down with the axe. And that's what Dad used to do when he was a young fella. That's how they cleared the land. And then by the time I came along, they used to have some bulldozers, but we still had to go and clear all the bush up ourselves. And that's how I grew up, basically.
So the next slide shows us something of it, because now I can't believe this. I mean, it's obviously true, but tell us about the population in the bush.
Well, when I grew up, Western Australia is the size of India, more or less. And when I grew up, Western Australia had a population of about 1.5 million or something like that, and well over half of that lived in Perth. So you're talking about an area the size of India, which would have had possibly 500,000 people. It's grown a bit now. It might have doubled in size now, but still it's not very big, considering that 2 million people live in Perth, and less than a million people live in the rest of the area the size of India. So the Shire where I grew up, for instance, was 1,250 square kilometres. Don't ask me what that is in miles. But that is the size of many, many British counties. So Babbington School was one of about 5 schools in the entire Shire. And I checked it out, and there's actually the area where the kids from my little school would have come from would have been the size of a number of, or I think 3 or 4 small British counties. So it was pretty remote. It was 75 kids when I started in grade 1 and 63, and there were 25 kids in the school when I left at the end of 1969, for instance. So we had to go a long distance in order to get to school. But most of the, if not all the kids were actually from farming backgrounds. So it was pretty remote, very, very sparsely populated.
Wow, it's hard to imagine that, and must be a challenge to live in a metropolis after that, I should think.
Well, it was when I went to boarding school. I got a scholarship to Scotch College for must have been my sporting, because it wasn't my good looks or anything like that. And when I got there, I think the second day I was there, I already teamed up with a couple of rebels, and we opened the windows and took off. And I could not handle being stuck inside four walls, and I kept opening the window every night, just taking off and wandering around in the city, or actually where I was, but it wasn't so much city, until I got caught. I only got caught twice in the first few months I was there. Second time was for drinking stuff, which wasn't water. And I should have been kicked out in the first couple of months. But we had a very sympathetic headmaster. And he, if he went by the letter of the law, I should have been kicked out. But he was a very graceful headmaster and said, "Crombie, I'll give you a second chance, but I'm keeping an eye on you." And so I said, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir." And I stayed and managed to get through. But I was never comfortable in the city. I was a bush boy, but I wasn't a farmer, and that was the big problem for me, because when you're living in the bush, in a sense, you've got to have that sort of personality that goes with the farming, which is hard working and hard drinking and all that sort of stuff. And I wasn't really in that camp. But in the city, I couldn't really hack the city life either. And so I was sort of caught between these two societies for a number of years, and a bit confused as to my identity. Who was I? But when I was very young, a very small kid, from about the age of 5, that's when I got my interest in Israel.
Let's just see the next picture then, because that goes with this, I think, doesn't it? Which is Bill Barron Hall then?
Well, where I came from, there were 3 small, we call them sidings. That's where wheat silos were. So there was no town. It was just basically a wheat silo and a couple of houses. So Babbickan, Bill Barron and Ardith. And so we used to always be involved in one of the 3 places. And I don't know how, I must have been probably about 8 or so there in that picture. But it was at that age that already I was developing an interest. And that was because I had a fascination about my uncle. I think the next picture might be my uncle.
It's not. He's the last one.
He's the last one. Go to the last one first, if you don't mind. Because this uncle, he died at Tobruk, and I was always fascinated about this uncle, why he went away and whatever else. And so my interest in Israel began with him, because I had managed to get some letters and some coins that were sent back after he was killed, after he died. And then I began to sort of branch out from that, and was reading war books and the Purnell's history of the Second World War, for instance. And as things went on, by the age of 12, I was already reading stuff about the Holocaust. I went in once to our local news agency, local being about 20 miles away, to buy a football magazine or a cricket magazine. And I saw a book on Treblinka. Now, I was probably about 12 years of age. And I bought the book on Treblinka rather than the sporting magazine. Now, you know, what 12-year-old Gentile boy with no Christian background, no Jewish background does that? So obviously the law was in my life. Even to the point where an Israeli family, I told you how remote Babbickan was. Well, an Israeli family came to live on a farm close to Babbickan. Their kids came to our school, 2 Israeli kids. And I used to collect postage stamps and got all their postage stamps from Israel. And so there was lots of little things which happened in the period up until I was 12, which laid a foundation in my life, which when I became a teenager, they were sort of suppressed. If you go back to the previous picture, sport became the idol of my life after that, whether I was at Scotch College in Perth or university or back in Babbickan. It was always sport and drinking and whatever else. Then I got to a stage in my life when I was about 20 when I was totally lost. Didn't know if I should be in the city, didn't know whether I should be in the country. I wasn't a farmer. My brothers didn't really want me on the farm anyway. They used to think I was lazy. Well, physically I was. And so then suddenly in that period of time, all of that childhood interest came back again. And the stimulus was the Entebbe raid in 1976. When I became aware of the Entebbe raid, it was like, Israel, yeah, and everything came back again. So from that point onwards, it was a matter of preparing to go over to Israel, which I finally did when I was 21 at the age in 1978. So I went through these phases in my life, and thankfully, all the stuff that was done when I was a young kid came back to the foreground, and that actually what led me ultimately to go to Israel. And I was searching, and I just knew there was an answer to life, and I knew I'd find that in Israel. And finally, he found me.
So tell me now, just, sorry, the last sentence, I was just conversing with Joel, but when you left Australia and went to Israel, just go over again those circumstances and what you expected to find, what you expected to do when you got there.
Well, I expected to find an answer to what life was all about. But I didn't go straight away because I knew something would happen there. So I thought I got to live life to the fullest. I did Europe for a whole year, which is the beer fest, getting drunk in the King's Head and Earl's Court, which most Australians had to do that. You can't be an Australian and go to London without getting blind drunk in the King's Head. And did Eastern Europe, did the Soviet Union, all those sorts of things, Greek islands. I had to get all that done before I got to Israel. So I finally got to Israel. And as soon as I landed in Israel, I realized I'm not Jewish, and I'm not a born-again Christian, but I sensed peace. I just felt I was at home. Now, on the kibbutz, for those who've been on the kibbutz, they can understand this. It's a pretty hedonistic lifestyle, and I was very much into that hedonistic lifestyle at the time. Yet at the same time, you've got people on the kibbutz who'd survived the Holocaust, who survived the wars, who'd come from all over the world. I mean, one guy I walked with, he and his brother had walked from Manchuria, walked, hitchhiked, bust, whatever else, to come to the land of Israel. So you have people that have fascinating stories.
Hang on, where's Manchuria?
Manchuria, China.
Oh,
basically.
Wow.
So on the kibbutz, you had people, you had living history. When I was studying history at the UWA, I gave it up because it was all about books. And I said I was going to learn by experience. So when I went to the kibbutz, there was living history. You could sit down and just start a conversation with any of the Israelis, and it was living history. And yet you can go off and get, have a beer or 3 or 4 with the rest of the wild volunteers afterwards. So it combined those aspects of my life. But even so, it still wasn't answering the question. So you can only sort of endure a certain period of this sort of wild lifestyle, because for about 3 years I was pretty wild and reckless. Even when I was working in a farm in England, whatever we earned was spent in the Bo Peep pub, which is right next door. So for about 2 or 3 years being over Europe, I was living this lifestyle. And then it got to the point where I thought, no, it's just not cutting the mustard. What is that answer? And I was back on the kibbutz. I was back in Israel on the kibbutz again. And I actually then realized, well, it must be to go in the army. It must be to become an Israeli. So I was encouraged then to consider conversion. And by that stage, I thought, well, this is it. Finally, I found what it's all about, the answer. And I was in the process of actually going to begin the conversion process. And thankfully, I didn't actually officially begin it because there's another guy in the kibbutz who was converting at the time. And I was talking to him about it, reading his stuff. And then I realized, well, this is all about religion. And I wasn't interested in religion. So I just suddenly realized, well, this is not it. Converting to Judaism is not it. I'm not interested in religion. Well, I still wanted to live in Israel, but now the avenue for doing so was not there anymore. So I just spiraled downwards and really went into a big hole. Remember a guy called Yuval, he was working in the ref at the dairy, and I happened to be working there at the time. And he was on Entebbe. He was one of the paratroopers at Entebbe, so I got to know him quite well. I remember him saying to me one day, he says, Kelvin, Makaralacha, what is wrong with you? You used to be the life of the party. Look at you now. And he was right. I mean, I wouldn't say depressed, but it was like the light had gone out. I didn't know where to search anymore. I didn't know where to go. The hedonistic lifestyle didn't suit this whole thing of Judaism. And right at that juncture, a Christian came to the kibbutz and began to share with me about Jesus. Wasn't interested in Jesus, but then I went with this person and some others to Jerusalem. It was Easter and Passover that year. It was 1981. And we went to the Garden Tomb. And I actually found some of my old letters the other day because I'm writing all this life story up at the moment. And I actually wrote back to my mother the impact that sermon had at the Garden Tomb. And the man who preached that sermon was David Price, who was the minister at Christ Church, Jerusalem. I didn't know that, but it was about the Jewishness of Jesus, Passover and Easter at the same time. And that was it. I just knew that was the truth because he spoke about the Jewish connection. This Christian had been telling me about Jesus. I said, not interested in Jesus. Okay, the Christians are all wrong. They're all hypocrites. If there's a God, he's the God of Israel and the Jewish people. I saw either or. Yet David Price is bringing together and say it's not an either or, it's a both and that was it. But, of course, being a man, pride, I'm not going to admit to this Christian girl that she was right. I'm not going to admit to everybody else that they were right. This Jesus was right. So it took me another 3 months before I finally committed my life to the Lord, and that was back in London. And then not long after I committed my life to the Lord, I was back in Israel again, working as an orderly in a hospital for handicapped children, and a completely different worldview, completely different life, and things just began. And suddenly all those things that I was interested in as a kid, they came back in the right time. And a lot of it had to do when I started working as the guide in Christchurch. Suddenly all those interests came back, and now I can see there's a sense to all this. It was like one big plan of God's geopolitical sovereignty over history. And a lot of that stuff all began from living in the bush when I was a kid, when all those interests first began. When I was fascinated by Britain, I was an Anglophile, I was a Britophile as a kid. I was thoroughly intrigued by Britain and all that sort of stuff and how it all fit together, East India's Company and the First World War, Second World, Monty, Allenby, the whole works. And yet here I am in the right time, the jigsaw puzzles begin to come together. God's sovereignty. Absolute sovereignty.
Wow, that is absolutely fascinating story, and I think your dislike of wanting to be a farmer in the bush was a blessing for the world, Kelvin, and all the work you've done, all the books you've written, the history, the research you've done and are doing is unique, and nobody else has done quite what you've done, I don't think.
God's grace. That's all it is. It's God's grace.
Yeah. The continuing of the miracles, the God of miracles, the God of Israel. Israel's a miracle in itself. They just need to see it a bit more clearly. Let's just move on to a couple of notices. We have to have notices. Every meeting has to have them. Next Wednesday, Paul Hocking is talking on Leviticus, and I'm sure he's going to make it absolutely riveting. That's Wednesday at 2. And in the evening, on next Wednesday, there's the prayer meeting with Scott Morgan of Shorish Tours. He's not been very busy recently, but I'm sure he's got stacks of plans for the future. So let's meet together if you can and pray for him. Thank you. And the next one is the staycation. So if you would like to come with me and with my husband, Chris, around Britain on a bus for 9 days, we are having a staycation, and we're looking this is the 11th to the 19th of September, and we're looking at the roots of CMJ and of the Pilgrim Fathers. Last year was the 400th anniversary of the sailing of the Mayflower, and I planned a tour for them. And this is the sailing of the Mayflower's 400th anniversary, take 2, and it's next month. And these are some of the places we'll go to. Steve Maltz is joining us on the last day to speak about the East End of London, where Jewish people first settled when they came here. Michael Solomon Alexander is not speaking, but we will speak about him down in Plymouth. So do join us if you can. There's the brochure. It's available on our website and also from the booklet that I wrote for the Olive Press booklet on the Pilgrim Fathers is available also from the office for free. If you want that, just ask. Thank you. So do come, do ring me if you're interested. Do email me on janem@cmj.org.uk. In October, I've got Aaron. I nearly said I've got Moses. Moses by Aaron, or Aaron as our man is called. And that's why they knew that Moses wore a wig, don't they? Because sometimes he was seen with Aaron and sometimes without. But maybe I'll tell that every time he speaks. Spoil his thunder. So he's with us on the 4th to the 14th of October. So far, I've had 2 inquiries from where was it? From Suffolk or Norfolk, and from Glasgow. And so we will be around the country face to face. Okay, thank you. The next one. If you are a CMJ rep, and in a sense, everybody who's a member of CMJ is a kind of rep for CMJ, representing CMJ in their churches. And if you'd like to make that official, you can get in touch with me. And one of the things that we do is have an annual conference. And this year, Darrell Fenton will be the guest speaker. His strength, I think, is in teaching people how to reach Jewish neighbors. Strengthening churches in Jewish areas in America is what he was doing before he went to be the director in Israel. So he's going to be in a church, and he's going to be telling the congregation there or the group interested there how to reach their Jewish neighbors. And we will be there with him, listening and observing, and lots more besides. So if you're interested in becoming a rep, get in touch with me. Thank you. Next one. This again is the giving slide. If you want to just take a note of that, please do. And the next one. We had this the other day, and what else can we say after all that we've heard, after all that Kelvin has shared, after the questions and the comments that you have brilliantly sent in, and that Kelvin has spoken about, commented on, answered. It just shows us once again the God of miracles. And Isaiah, it always strikes me as nothing short of a miracle that the book that the Dead Sea Scrolls presented to us in completion is Isaiah. And in Isaiah, everything is contained. The whole story, the whole salvation plan absolutely blows you away, doesn't it? And Zion had said, the Lord has forsaken me. My Lord has forgotten me. Can a woman forget her nursing child and not have compassion on the son of her womb? Surely they may forget. Yet I will not forget you. See, I've inscribed you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are continually before me, says the Lord. Isaiah 49, 14 to 16. I think that sums it all up. The Jewish people have suffered tremendously over all of the time, ever since the beginning. And yet God has fulfilled the prophecies that he gave to them, and he is doing. And the rebirth of Israel is completely miraculous. And it's been incredible to behold that, hasn't it? Even though we were born after, we've seen the fruit of it. We've seen the progress, and we've seen God's hand, even in stopping missiles from hitting particular destinations and being blown off course into the sea. All kinds of things. I'm sure you've got many stories you can give to add to those. So before we pray, I'll just show the last. Have you got the last slide there, or was that the last one, Joel? Thought so. Have to have my cloud again. It just looks like the dove, the Holy Spirit, an angel. I don't know, but so very different from anything else in the sky that day. Nothing. They were all just stripy clouds, just this shape. So let's pray together. You can take that off. And again, I think I'm going to ask you, Kelvin, to pray for the subject we've talked about today, and for the people watching, and for what they'll take back to their friends, family, and churches. And then I'll pray for you.
So, Abba Father, we do give you thanks, Lord, once again for the gifts that you give to us. And Lord, for the callings you place upon our lives. But that, Lord, ultimately, Lord, well, my prayer, Lord, is that you would help myself, help Jane, help CMJ, help all the viewers to be able to take what we've been able to research and hear about. And Lord, to be able to use this, Lord, in a redemptive way, that we may be able to present this information, Lord, to people in such a way that it would cause their hearts to change. Lord, in particular, we desire to see Jewish people be introduced into a personal relationship with their Messiah. And Lord, if this perspective, Lord, is one particular way that this can happen, then we're asking, Father God, please do it. Please help us to have your strategy of how we can use this information. Lord, I ask and pray these things in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.
Amen. Father, we want to pray for Kelvin, for your blessing upon him and upon Lexi, his wife, and upon their children and their grandchildren. Father, we pray that you will keep Kelvin and the family in perfect health, that you will restore health if necessary and bless them. We pray that you will put that hedge of protection around the Crombie family, that the enemy will not get in and will not strike. Father, bless them. Bless their endeavors, lead their futures, and bless the work of their hands. And bless Kelvin, Lord, in the future research as he's writing this book on the Netherlands at the moment, and as he has going to add chapters to things and all kinds of other projects. And as he then is able to continue his research, be with him, Lord, in every decision, in every journey, and everywhere he goes, and with Lexi in power. And so we lift them up to you, and we bless you for them and for all that they give to us. In the name of Jesus, the Messiah of Israel. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
So we really just want to thank you all for coming and joining us today. We hope that you have found it very interesting listening to Kelvin. I know that from the comments you've sent in, you've been very interested to hear what he shared already this week. And we're hopeful, Kelvin, that you will return in person soon to speak to us in the churches. So thank you all. And thank you very much, Joel, for all you've been doing behind the scenes today and in the other two open meetings. So thank you, Joel. And thank you for coming.